We now have in place the Glasgow Climate Pact, agreed amongst all the parties here. I would say, however, that this is a fragile win.
If you end COP26 and it don't look good, who you gonna call?
Growthbusters!
A post-mortem on COP26 and our chances for having a habitable climate next on the Growthbusters podcast.
Calling. Call the Growthbusters. Whoa.
We have an exciting episode of the Growthbusters podcast for you today. It is chock full. There's so much to talk about. We should be doing this podcast every week, but it's hard to get together. Let's see how much we can cram into one episode of the Growthbusters podcast. I'm Dave Gardner, Chief Scientist here at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies.
I'm Stephanie Gardner, a Growthbusters board member and clean energy nerd.
And I'm pretty excited. We've got a special guest with us in the studio today, Paul Sutton. He's a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Denver. He has guested on the podcast before, episode 26, Running Out of Gas. We'll put a link in the show notes if you haven't heard that. Very interesting and intelligent conversation. And I invited Paul. I really just was looking for a good excuse to get him back in. And this was a good one because Paul served as an official delegate for the American Association of Geographers, AAG, at the COP26 UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, early November of 2021. And we're going to be analyzing what took place at COP26 in terms of sustainability and the chances for human civilization hanging around on this planet a little longer. I do want to provide a little disclaimer for Paul. He is here speaking for himself. He's not speaking in an official capacity here today for the AAG. But thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here.
Really appreciate you investing the time. We usually try to do a little bit of listener feedback, so let's go through that real quick just because it's particularly relevant, I think. We got an email from Don recently who wrote, just listened to Black Friday, and what he was referring to was we always encourage people to watch the Growthbusters documentary on Black Friday instead of going shopping. Gather the family, pop some popcorn, and then you can have a good family discussion about consuming less and procreating less. And this was a special Black Friday because Growthbusters, we've been making it free just on Black Friday for the last several years, but it's free now forever because to celebrate its 10th anniversary and to do a good public service for the planet, we decided, okay, it's time. So it's free on YouTube. We'll put a link in the show notes. And that makes it really easy for you to share this movie with journalists who need some enlightenment, elected officials who definitely need some enlightenment, and educators. Paul Sutton doesn't need it because, you know, he's one of my favorite educators out there because he gets it, and you'll learn why and how as we go through this episode. Anyway, back to this email from Don. Just listened to Black Friday. I've spent the last month-ish binging on everything I could find on COP26. About 4 to 6 hours a day in my podcast feed. For the most part, population nor overshoot was even mentioned. With all the blah, blah, blah lip service to climate change, not one mention of the biggest source, way too many people, most of whom are consuming way too much. Meanwhile, Biden is asking OPEC to flood the oil market to keep our subsidized gas as cheap as bottled water. Also, today, Biden is auctioning off 80 million acres of the Gulf for exploration. Question mark and several exclamation points after that. And then, in parentheses, not to be taken literally, but I no longer care about the humans, but for every other life on the planet. I'm hoping for a more lethal COVID variant that will thin our herd. Remember, he said not to be taken literally, just a kind of a sentiment about his disappointment, I think, in the human race at this stage of the game.
Yeah, I would say our herd is going to get thinned. It's just we can be careful and thoughtful about it and minimize human suffering or not. The herd thinning is going to take place.
Yeah. Planned or unplanned. And Stephanie, poor Stephanie, you're going to get to watch it happen. You're going to see it go down.
Yep, definitely expecting all of that in my own lifetime.
One more quick comment I want to share, and this was a comment on the now free Growthbusters documentary on YouTube where people can comment. Daniel wrote, "So glad to be able to watch this finally after listening to the podcast for the past several months. The film holds up well. as unfortunately not much has changed in the last 10 years, except the dire warnings are more dire and the need to change course is even more critical. Everyone should watch this and start listening to the podcast too. Well, I couldn't agree more, if I do say so myself.
About things getting more dire, or people should listen to the podcast and watch the film?
A and B.
A and B, all of the above.
All of the above, pretty much. Sad to say. Next segment, of course, of the podcast is In the News, and we've got some important reading. There's so much more than I could even pack into this list that I gave you, Paul and Stephanie. But at the top of the list is I did want to toot my own horn a little bit in the important reading department and mention that I wrote an essay. I was invited to do this by Fair Start Movement. And by the time you hear this, this is going to be published also at Medium. And the title of the essay is Insist That Public Policy Respects the Rights of Children and Women.
Ooh, tricky.
Well, after you've been at it long enough, you figure out some good ways to frame the argument. I had to be on my best behavior for Fair Start Movement because this is a great organization. I believe a lot in them, and they're doing good work, and they don't pick fights as often as I do. They're not as politically incorrect as I sometimes can be just here at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies. But anyway, so we'll put a link in the show notes to this essay because public policy, it's really in the news, and we'll talk more about that because policymakers are beginning to, for the most part, they're taking note that women around the world are making more informed family-size decisions, which ought to be celebrated as good news, but a lot of policymakers aren't seeing that. So we need to talk about public policy, and this piece was my wish for policymakers to be fully informed about overshoot and overpopulation as they try to develop public policy. Hopefully they can develop public policy that will help to minimize childhood poverty without attempting to goose population.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah. And then hot off the presses, got an email just this morning from Monica Sigliano, who's a researcher and policy advisor at Population Matters, great UK-based organization working hard to get overpopulation literacy up around the world. They've published a new report called Welcome to Gilead, Pronatalism and the Threat to Reproductive Rights. And this report examines the threat to reproductive rights posed by pronatal policies.
I like the nod to Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah,
absolutely.
If our listeners are familiar with that.
It's not as politically correct a paper. You might trick people with your title, public policy respecting the rights of children and women. You might get the other side to read it, but Welcome to Gilead, I think you turn off a whole bunch of people with that kind of title.
I'm kind of surprised because Population Matters does such a good job. They don't mince words, but they do a pretty good job of getting dialogue going with policymakers. Policymakers aren't necessarily following their advice and guidance, but they at least have a seat at the table sometimes.
Yeah, no, this is great that you try and get policymakers to read these kind of things and make them accessible.
Yeah, so that's good news. And then I'm sharing To Breed or Not to Breed, a news story in the New York Times by Alex Williams. In a world of pandemic chaos, political strife, and climate catastrophe, some would-be parents see the future as too dark to procreate.
One thing that I thought was very interesting about this is they cited a couple of surveys that have been done in the last few years. And it turns out that people of childbearing age are really starting to think about the climate as a huge factor in their decision-making around whether to have children or not. So I think they cited a survey that they did last year. 1 in 4 respondents cited climate change as a factor and why they currently do not have children. And then they had another poll back in 2018, and they found that among young adults in the United States who said they had or expected to have fewer children than the number they considered ideal, a third of those listed climate change, and a little over a quarter of them named population growth as a concern. So I actually found these statistics pretty surprising because it doesn't seem like that has been part of the conversation, at least in my own personal experience that people are talking about those things and that it is a big factor that people are taking into consideration. So I consider that to be kind of good news on the one hand, that people are thinking about the consequences of bringing more children onto the planet. But it's also, it's sad that that's the state of the planet, that we have to be taking those tough decisions.
Yeah, I read this piece in the New York Times, and it was really interesting to me that, like Stephanie's saying, is people are talking about this. I'm running into people that are talking about this. I've read pieces in the New York Times about this eco-anxiety. People are talking to therapists about this sort of general low-level anxiety that things are not as good as the neoliberal economists would like us to believe. So I think this is really interesting that this is happening.
Yeah, so this is really pretty much, I think, kind of a good news report. This is a rare piece that doesn't set this up as some kind of a disaster, which is nice. Yeah. And you be interfacing with college students all the time. I bet you are having a lot of dialogue about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I teach a class called Envisioning Utopia through the lens of a Wellbeing Economy, which is a critique of the neoliberal economic paradigm and addresses capitalism and its growth imperative and its impact on the environment. And I try and be in the solution. I use Hunter Lovin's book, A Finer Future, Building an Economy in Service to Life. Mm-hmm. But the students are still saying they're depressed because of the things we talk about in the class and the things they see going on. They don't see, none of them want to be teachers. Very few of them want to go to the healthcare field. None of them want to be civil engineers. They all want to be venture capitalists or hedge fund managers, thinking that people like Jeff Bezos are going to save the world more than government. They've really lost faith in governance, and they see Bezos going to Mars. And I critique that quite a bit, and I saw a lot of critique of that on the streets of Glasgow.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. We'll talk more about that, about what you saw on the streets while you were out there. But yeah, Stephanie, do you think, you're living it, you're approaching mid-30s. I hate to call you mid-30s. That makes you seem old and me feel old. But it's your generation, and it seems to me like just in the last 3 years, the perspective has really gotten a lot more negative. A lot. Yeah,
I think that's right. But I think people are also trying to view things in a more positive light. I think about some of my friends that are deciding to be child-free, and they're embracing the freedom that comes with that, the ability to do passion projects and spend their time in other ways than child rearing. And they participate in the lives of children all the time. They are aunts and uncles. They are teachers teaching young children. They love children, and they're able to incorporate that into their lives without actually having children themselves. And that can actually be really empowering to people. So yeah, there is this doom and gloom overhead, but I think people are turning it into, well, I can still have a great life and contribute without having children myself.
Sarah Bexell, as you know, professor of social work at the University of Denver, is on the same page as a lot of these articles about changing attitudes about women having no children. My wife has no children, and she's happy. And she always points to studies that show that a lot of people that are childless are happier throughout the course of their lives. And she is very involved in adopted nieces and nephews and actual blood family nieces and nephews and everything that Stephanie just said. A child-free life can be very rewarding and fulfilling. In fact, the evidence suggests it's more rewarding.
Yeah, if the world wasn't going to hell in a handbasket, there'd still be plenty of good reasons. Plenty of good reasons to choose a child-free lifestyle. It just happens now that although the surveys aren't bearing out that this is the number one reason, but in my view, the number one reason is because we need far fewer people on the planet. If we want the human experiment to continue, we have got to get our numbers down.
Oh, no, I agree. I think it's a good thing. It's sad the reasons people feel like they can't have children.
Yeah.
But ultimately, this is the path forward.
Yeah. And then one other in the Important reading department, great piece by Richard Heinberg, The End of Growth, 10 Years After. We'll put a link in the show notes. And I think I'm going to repost that in the Medium publication that Jim Randles and I curate, Ending Overshoot. So that'll be another good place to find it. But he wrote some interesting things on the 10-year anniversary of his really excellent book, The End of Growth, which I'm a big fan of, and also mentions that next year is going to be the 50-year anniversary of Limits to Growth. Hard to believe.
I asked my students how many people have heard of the Limits to Growth. 0 out of 40 this fall quarter.
Yeah,
Wow.
That's a shame. What about your friends and peers, Stephanie? Do they know about Limits to Growth?
Well, I did an environmental studies major in college, and we definitely learned about it in my coursework there. But more broadly than the self-selecting group in that program, I'm not sure that many people have heard about it, no.
Yeah. So I think we're going to do something to observe the 50th anniversary and do a lot of talking about that.
What I love to show my students is the follow-up studies on the limits to growth. I mean, it was an aspatial model that involved a lot of feedback between, differential equations of population, the economy, pollutants, etc. But when you look at that model to the present with actual data, it is right on the money. Astonishingly right on the money. It's better than any climate models going on.
Wow.
Yeah. And what that means is that we are living, we're just into it, aren't we? We're into
overshoot and collapse.
And collapse, yeah. Just look at the graphs in that business as usual scenario from Limits to Growth. So if you're not familiar with it, all of that initial published study is available online. We'll put a link in the show notes so you can go straight to it. Don't have to buy the book. I don't know if you can even buy the original book today. But I just want to quote a couple of things that Richard Heinberg mentioned in his piece. The scale of expansion since the dawn of the fossil-fueled industrial revolution, beginning roughly at the start of the 19th century, has been unprecedented. Energy usage per capita has grown 800%, as has population. 800%. Talk about astonishing. And of course, he says, growth has become routinized, studied, measured, and institutionalized. Economists now regard it as normal, beneficial, and even essential. And if you're a regular listener to the Growth Busters podcast or a student in one of Paul's classes, then you realize that that's not really good news. And Richard writes about 3 main factors that he felt would ultimately limit growth: finite resources, pollution, such as the climate-disrupting carbon dioxide that we've got going on in too big a way right now, and unrepayable debt was, interestingly, the third item.
Yeah, this debt grows, right? I mean, we have fiat currency, and we have this sort of, built-in growth of money, when money is debt, and it just grows forever, and that may be one of the driving forces for growth.
Yeah, and Richard takes a pretty, he's not totally... I don't get the sense that he is a 100% solid critic of solar and wind power, but he's done a lot of research on this, and his research shows that we cannot run our current economic model on solar and wind. We can't just flip a switch and use quote-unquote renewable energy to power this growth-obsessed culture that we've got going.
Well, that sort of ties into that movie Planet of the Humans, right? It was a very controversial movie, but I think it made some pretty valid points that, the whole idea of a Green New Deal where we can have the perpetual growth of the neoliberal agenda, except it's going to be done with solar panels and wind turbines, I think is a naive fantasy.
Yeah. And in this piece, he actually says that if we were lucky enough that we could actually, create the first generation of infrastructure to do this, which really would create this huge blip of fossil fuel emissions, which would kill us right there. But if somehow we could do it without that, then 25 years later, we got to be ready to replace most of that infrastructure, and we're just not going to have the resources to do that. Sorry, Steph.
The bad news continues.
Yeah. Your rosy future depends on energy descent. We have got to just do less.
Yeah, I'm glad that we have these brave souls giving us a reality check, because it sounds like so many of us are banking on this idea that our technology is going to save us And it's so much more nuanced than that. It's the supply and demand side of the equation. We can't just exist as we are and use all of the energy and resources we want in a renewable fashion. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah. And as Mike Nickerson likes to say, it's more fun, less stuff.
Amen. What's wrong with sitting around a campfire and playing guitar?
There you go. It turns out that's a whole lot more fun than managing a hedge fund.
Or following Twitter accounts.
Yep. Okay, and I wanted to throw this in the news department, and we'll eventually get back around to COP26, I promise.
Maybe it's the apocalypse.
The new Ghostbusters movie is out, Ghostbusters Afterlife, and I went and saw it. I had to because, the original Ghostbusters was really the inspiration for the title of my documentary, Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth, and the inspiration for me putting on the funny outfit and creating the backpack and all that. I think it was a pretty brilliant title and a pretty brilliant thing to do to add a little levity to a really dark subject. So I really do want to just give a nod to Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis for writing that original script for that 1984 film, Ghostbusters. And they did not write this new Ghostbusters Afterlife. Of course, Harold Ramis is no longer with us, but we do get to see a little bit of Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray in the film. But it's a good family film, and there's no great theme in there about overconsumption or any. For those themes, you're going to have to watch Growthbusters, but it's a good film, and I recommend that you check it out. And Stephanie, I just wanted to mention, you haven't seen it yet, right?
No, I haven't yet.
You need to see it because one of the main characters, Phoebe, reminds me of your longtime friend, Hannah Montana, as I like to call her.
She hates that nickname.
But she's finally gotten used to it a little bit. So now I'm going to have to call her Phoebe. We'll see how she feels about that. Okay, and then number 3 item in the news, this kind of circles back to the surveys about why childless adults don't expect to ever have children, why the young people today are choosing to delay starting a family or never have a family. And so there was this new research poll from Pew that indicated that 44% of current non-parents between 18 and 49 said that they're unlikely to have children someday. And that was a huge increase from the 2018 survey. And then that 26% of people in that group said they were very likely to have children someday, which was down from 32% in 2018. So those were 2 big shifts. And I want to share the reaction that we got from CBS Mornings on television about it.
People problem we've got in this country. There's not enough people. If you go back to 1950, the average woman in this country had nearly 4 children. Today, it is below 2, the so-called replacement level. In other words, we're shrinking outside of immigration. And it looks like it's going to get worse. The Pew Research Center asked adult women and men who are not already parents how likely it is that they will have children someday. And the numbers dropped over the last time they asked this question. So you see, it is 23% say not at all likely. That's an increase from 2018. There was a decrease in those who say they are very likely. That dropped to 26%. So we got a problem, people. Our whole entire thing we're doing here as a country is more people paying taxes, paying benefits. We're getting older, and there's not enough coming up behind us. When you and I are looking to retire.
Yeah. You were talking about this last week, though, that we do have a lot more older people, not enough younger people.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. I actually talked to a demographer at USC last year, because this has been a problem for a little while. And he called it a crisis. He called it a full-on crisis. He said,
not having children.
Cost of housing, cost of education, cost of childcare, these are all more difficult. He's like, boomers do not get it, how much harder it is now for millennials. People are not having kids, and it's going to catch up with us.
I remember I wanted kids since I was in 7th grade, and I realize now having children isn't for everybody, and I think it's good if you make that decision. But I just think children just change everything for the better.
So
why they even get time on television to say stuff like that is amazing to me. And it's the pronatalism bias that you've talked about. We just saw a bunch of papers on. Nandita works on this kind of stuff. It's unbelievable to me. How does it raise the cost of housing to have more people? I think when you have a population decline, you have a surplus of housing, and the cost of housing comes down. I'm just amazed they let guys like this go on in such a clueless manner.
Yeah, and from a cultural perspective, women's rights have advanced. I'm personally grateful that I am not stuck at home raising 4 children because I have other passions and interests, and I wanted to get a master's degree. I wanted to go out and work in an industry that I was interested in and I felt like would improve the planet. Women aren't just baby makers. We are individuals. We can be intellectuals. We can do anything we want. And why do we have to be forced into this box? And, Dad, I think you were mentioning the essay that you wrote for the Fair Start movement, and I really liked what you wrote. It really reframed how these pronatalist policies are treating women like their only purpose is to be baby-making machines, and our children are just taxpayers and consumers. Like, we're people here. There's got to be more to this.
We're going to need women freed from motherhood to help solve the problems to keep human civilization going forward.
Yeah, imagine how much better shape we'd be in if women had been running the world for the last couple hundred years.
Amen.
But let's give credit where credit is due. First of all, let me mention about the sound quality of that clip was a little bit less than our usual supreme because I just pointed my cell phone at the TV and played that back right after I happened to catch that going, and I just captured it just in case I couldn't go back and find it somewhere on the internet later, and I haven't been able to find it, so I can't give you a link to that. That conversation flew by and it never got stored except on Dave Gardner's cell phone, as far as I know. But that was Tony DeCoppel doing most of the talking, and then he was chatting with co-hosts on CBS Mornings, Nate Burleson and Gayle King. And Tony wisely kind of fessed up and identified the Ponzi scheme. He basically said, this is a problem because we've got a Ponzi scheme. He didn't call it that, but he said, we've got this thing going in our country where we need babies in order to be the taxpayers of the future. He just didn't recognize that it was a confession of stupidity.
Yeah, it's interesting. Stephen Chu, who was in President Obama's cabinet, called the whole economic system a Ponzi scheme based on population growth. He was smart. I think we need to pay attention to Japan because Japan's going through this population decline. Their population is declining. Their fertility has been in these terrible, disastrous places for a long time. And there's a lot of people like Tony DeCoppel who get a lot more airtime than you or I saying, oh, this is a demographic disaster. But I think we should pay attention to Japan because they're probably the template for a surviving human civilization.
Yeah, and I really hate to just rip them apart and rip them to shreds, try to embarrass them, back them into a corner, because I don't think that's going to change their thinking. And so that's really not my purpose in bringing this up and playing this today. My purpose really is to just say, wow, can you believe it? Can you believe that these 3 anchors that are in America's living rooms 5 mornings a week are not aware of overshoot? Can it be?
I don't know. You see it. It's not just those 3 anchors. You hear that kind of diatribe. You see it written in the Wall Street Journal. You see it written in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Demographers and planners are all about some sort of perpetual growth fantasy. And I think most people get that it's not viable. Most people do, if they think about it.
That's frustrating.
You have to hope. I do think that the younger generations they're not buying into it. They're not going to go out and have 4 kids each. We're just not at that point. And I think the surveys we've cited today even indicate that people are thinking about these things, and these anchors are out of touch with the younger generations. A lot of the politicians they're kind of at that age where the younger generations are on a different page, and we really need our leadership to start paying attention. And the younger generations absolutely get it. It's the older folks that really need to figure it out.
But it just goes to show that whole growth worshiping paradigm is, it is so powerful and it's so entrenched that maybe, you didn't really say this, Stephanie, but maybe our only hope is for the people who have been so fully programmed and indoctrinated into that. We just have to wait for them to die because we can't change their minds.
That's how it changes in academia. One funeral at a time.
Oh, man. One funeral at a time.
Well, it seems like they're really disconnected with quantitative ability, right? I mean, to me, the surprising thing about my job as an academic is I'm just pitching this you can't grow forever on a finite planet idea, and it seems like that's obvious.
Ought to be.
But for some people, it's not. Yeah. I mean, it's dogmatic, but once you get people to think, they get it.
So, Stephanie, we need your peers to take over as quickly as possible.
Sounds like it.
So now, finally, we can kind of get into COP26. Paul, you were there. You went to Glasgow, and I want to fully tap your experience and reaction and what you thought about what you saw.
Yeah, I was allowed to be an AAG observer delegate, and so I got to fly to Scotland and emit a bunch of CO2.
Shame on you.
I dovetailed it with the visit to my sister, who just moved to the UK because she couldn't take the Trump administration. She has abandoned the United States.
Good on you for killing two birds with one flight.
But I did feel bad about that. But I also feel like we send football teams all over the place and advertising executives, and so I'm fighting for, I took the population message, I published a piece in The Hill saying, what about population? And as one of your commenters said, there was nothing mentioned about population at the COP. In fact, it was kind of taboo. They kind of all moved away from you on the Group W bench if you started talking about population. And I was disappointed, but not surprised. COP felt like an airport without any airplanes, a bunch of people in Prada bags and Gucci suits wandering around trying to impress their followers on Twitter and in various media things, all these setups for doing media, right? It was kind of like this podcast situation. There was 10 of these in every little room, and everybody's like blah, 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 blah. And I think Greta Thunberg nailed it. It's blah, blah, blah. I'm not impressed by the agreements. A fragile win is the best they can say. That's their positive spin on it, is a fragile win. So I definitely enjoyed the street protests more. I went to the Friday youth protest, which was a general strike, and I'm increasingly coming of the opinion that it's going to take a general strike. I think the people get it more than the venture capitalists and the Jeff Bezoses and the politicians. The people get the seriousness of our problem. And it is not just climate change. It's climate change interacting with extinction, interacting with land degradation, interacting with and tied to ocean acidification. It's overfishing of the fisheries. It's loss of coastal wetlands. It's half the coral reefs are gone. There's a lot of things going on. And the wheels on the bus are getting wobbly. And I think the people get it more than the politicians.
Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing some of the photographs that you took on the street, and the signs were brilliant. And you're telling us you don't think that that's just a tiny little fraction of the general public.
It was 100,000 people. That's 1 in 5 people in the city of Glasgow.
Wow.
I mean, here in the United States, we don't get it as much as people in Europe get it. And I think in other parts of the world, they're suffering so much that they can't get it, right? Bill Gates loves to say, hey, extreme poverty is declining. And he points to one of these graphs from Our World in Data that says people living on $1.90 a day has dropped down to less than 10%. We're achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And other people like Jason Hickel at the London School of Economics says, why do you pick $1.90 a day? It takes $7.80 a day to buy enough food to live to a normal life expectancy. And the number of people living on $7.80 a day or less is growing and is over 50%. So, wow. I mean, we can paint these glowing figures, but we got to do the numbers right. And we have to be honest about the math involved. And I think there is a innumeracy out there that a lot of the people get. And I don't think the governments get it, or they think it's not going to be so bad.
Why do you think their heads are in the sand?
This is sort of how evil can I think they are? Sometimes I think they're like, I'm just going to die. They're atheists and they have big piles of money and the system is treating them quite well, and they're not really interested in system change because they get to fly into space and they get to not have to be in the traffic. They take helicopters here and there and everywhere. And I also think there are some scientists that paint a not so scary picture, So the IPCC report involves these representative concentration pathways that say if we emit so much greenhouse gases, the increased watts per square meter is going to be 2.4 or 4.5 or 8.6. And so those are the RCPs. But what feeds into those models are these things called the shared socioeconomic pathways. Brian O'Neill, who was at the University of Denver in the past, was one of the lead architects of creating these shared socioeconomic pathways. And so he's modeled the future, just like Limits to Growth. And every single one of his models has increased GDP, increased population, and increased average levels of well-being globally. So there is no scenario going forward with all the different levels of climate change where we're worse off. And so this is in the IPCC report. You are a government official reading this and you're going, what are we so wound up about? We're going to be, on average, better off across the board. And the problem with the shared socioeconomic pathways is they're sort of endogenous. They just make assumptions that the world is going to be pretty much like it was yesterday going forward, and they have no feedbacks from the environment that are going to influence the economy, food supply, and that impacts human well-being, etc. So I think there's a lot of naive optimism in some of the science that's embedded in the IPCC report.
We'll be right back. I'm just going to go cry for a minute. Man, that is just, that is so sad. I do want to give you a shout out, Paul, for writing and getting published in The Hill just prior to COP26. Your piece, did you choose the title or did they come up with the headline over your piece? COP26. If we don't know where we're going, we will end up someplace else.
Oh, no, that was my title, but I stole it from my friend Robert Costanza, who's active in this area and does a lot of work on ecosystem service valuation and the loss of ecosystem services as a result of urbanization and growth. Loves the Yogi Berra quotes. And the whole idea, if we don't know where we're going, we'll end up someplace else. It's sort of satirical. It's a classic Yogi Berraism. But I think that's the problem, is we're not envisioning an end game that is basically has to be a population, I think probably 2 billion or less is the global total population. And we're not even trying to think about that. We're not even being honest with the people of the world that we need to degrow in a planned way to minimize human suffering to get to a place where everybody can have a high quality of life, high levels of freedom. And I think that's going to be around 2 billion. And if we don't know where we're going, and we're not talking about a global population of 2 billion at all. We're not talking about degrowth at all.
No one can imagine that.
We'll end up someplace else. And I think that's going to be one of these nasty, brutish, and short dystopian futures that I am very sad for Stephanie and my son about. Because I think when we started talking about climate change, sea level rise, sea level rise, sea level rise, and it's like, wow, look at all these fires, man.
Well, you did a good job in this piece. The highlights for me were that solving the climate crisis can't be left to economists because they're addicted to economic growth and therefore population growth. And those are the two things, economic growth and population growth, that are going to be the death of us if we can't get a handle on those. And you said outright that it can't be solved without shrinking our population.
Yeah. Additionally, expounding on that, shrinking our population, you're saying that the best long-term investment in climate change mitigation is providing family planning and contraception to the women of the world that simply want it but can't get it. And you sort of say that is the best spending of money compared to mitigation strategies, concrete projects, things like that. And one question that I had about this was, could this policy of family planning, contraception, can that work fast enough to keep us within that 1.5 degree C? Because we're really running out of time. We have a very short amount of time left to save the 1.5 degree goal. So is that enough, or does it have to be everything? Everything's on the table.
Well, I tried to keep it not too controversial. To me, it seems it's a good first start, right? So let's just provide contraception to the women of the world that want it. right? There's no coercion involved. You don't have to go down the rabbit hole of whether the one-child policy in China was good or bad. I personally think it was probably the most enlightened government policy in human history. However, poorly executed. Poorly executed in many ways, just like our retreat from Afghanistan was, but it was the right thing to do. Sometimes, no matter how far down the wrong road you go, when you figure out you're on the wrong road, you got to turn back, and it's not always pretty. No, I don't think it's enough to answer your question. And the short answer is no, it's not enough, but it's the palatable thing to talk about without pissing off a lot of people. It's just like, hey, these women want birth control, right? And it would only take, it's like $8 billion.
Drop in the bucket.
Or $10 billion. It's something like what we spend on Halloween costumes. I don't know if that stayed in the editorial or not. I usually write these things, and it's about 1,500 words, and I have a friend of mine strip it down so that I can get it published. But the cost of providing birth control to all the women of the world that would want it, that can't get it, is on the order of what we spend on Halloween costumes and candy for one day of the year. And most of that ends up in a landfill, right? And so I think that would bring us to ZPG. If all the women of the world that wanted contraception got it, it would bring us to zero population growth. And I actually think we have to go farther than that. We have to go to degrowth, but
it's a good start.
It's a good start, and it's affordable.
Yeah.
Kind of back to your question, I'll editorialize about that a little bit. It's something that we should have been working on 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, really. So let's not wait. So even though, if we're trying to come up with what's going to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is almost 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's remember that, because people in the U.S. tend to underthink this temperature thing. We've got 8 years to really drastically change things, and it'd be a good question to figure out if we had no births for the next 8 years, that might be a pretty significant contribution to emissions reduction, but we know we're not going to go to zero births for 8 years. That's not going to happen. So addressing the population issue isn't a short-term fix.
Not at all.
No. But it doesn't take as long as most people think either.
No, but you got to know where you're going.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll end up someplace else.
And we could get there. We could get there in 100 years or less if we got really serious about
Definitely.
it. Yeah. And so we ought to start now. But circling back yet again to your question, we obviously can't, because it's not going to keep us within our emissions budget to stay under 1.5 degrees of global warming. We've got to be doing a lot of other things.
We have to do all the energy transition stuff to wind and solar. We have to cut back on coal. We have to all of the other things have to be part of the answer, right? There's no silver bullet, but the long-term one and getting started now on population, I think it's sort of a foundational kind of move.
Yeah.
But the other things have to take place.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's interesting how much of our problems tie to this imbalance between gender, right? Yeah. Pronatalism, and it's astounding to me. I think, in Seneca Falls, women got together and had their declaration that said we should have the right to vote in 1848. And to me, that just is like so obvious that women should have equal contribution to electing people. But I bet all of those women died before women got the vote in the United States in 1920, right? They died.
Yeah.
Change takes time, right? And I think I'm tying it into women's rights, because I think the whole population thing has a whole gendered reality to it. But it took more than 70 years for women to get the right to vote. But once it happened, it was a fiat. It was a legislative fiat. We had the amendment to the Constitution, and snap your fingers, women have the right to vote. We're not going to have a legislative fiat that says, "Ooh, climate change is real," and then it's changed. This takes a concerted effort. Once you recognize you have to do something, you have to do something persistently for an extended period of time if you really want to avoid the damage. And I'm hopeful, but sadly I am not optimistic.
Well, you mentioned in your paper that solving the climate crisis shouldn't be left to economists. And yet one of the reports that I saw was bankers took over the climate change summit. That's bad for democracy. And I would think if bankers took over, I think that's the same thing as economists. Did you witness that?
Oh, I totally had that sense. I mean, there's a lot of Prada bags and Gucci suits and venture capitalists talking about how they were going to save the planet. And it made me nauseous because their best thinking got us here, right?
Yeah.
Economists got us here with this, religious belief that you can grow forever. And now, sadly, I think that they're very cynically going, ooh, this climate change fad. Look, Brian O'Neill and the shared socioeconomic pathways that says no matter what scenarios into the future, GDP goes up, population goes up, average human well-being goes up. I'll tell you how to make money because everybody thinks we have to do something about climate change. And they really don't think anything bad is going to happen. So that's my take on it. And I think we have to just say, no, we're not talking to you clowns. You guys got us into this mess. And it's my understanding the young staff members in the Biden administration don't want to listen to economists. They're done listening to economists. They're getting so much wrong. Trickle-down economics. Didn't see the global financial crisis coming. Economists have blown it. It is a discipline in a state of disarray. Economists, in many respects, I think, are comparable to Earth-centered astronomers that think that the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun goes around the Earth and the planets go around the Earth and the stars go around the Earth. We're in a Copernican revolution saying that neoliberalism is the wrong paradigm, but it's a painful transition.
And there are a few good economists out there. You know who you are, so you know we're not talking about you.
Correct. There's a few.
Not enough. So I'll put a link in the show notes to this New York Times story, Bankers Took Over the Climate Change Summit. That's bad for democracy if you want to go further down that rabbit hole. And just one more comment just about economists and this economic growth thing. Up to this point, so far, no one with any power to do anything about the climate crisis in a significant way has been willing to take economic growth off the table in order to solve the climate crisis. I think that's one of the main reasons that we haven't really made any headway is because everything that everyone's been trying has been, well, let's see if we can keep the economy growing, but tweak on this little knob a little bit and get emissions down.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden said, when I think about climate change and the ways to deal with it, I think about jobs, right? I mean, He's still tying dealing with climate change as part of a growing economic situation as a sort of a crisis opportunity.
Well, he has to sell it somehow.
And then maybe he thinks about it that way. I hope that's correct.
Yeah.
I just want to say, Paul, thank you so much for helping us decipher some of this stuff because it is really complex and what we're seeing in the mainstream is oftentimes sort of boiled down and it's unclear what it actually means for the climate. And so having your input is just supremely helpful for those of us that aren't close to this stuff.
No, it's my pleasure. And it's funny that this whole idea of recognizing that economic worldviews, the worldview of the neoliberal economists, the neoclassical economists, and the perpetual growth that's embedded in it, and their discounting of market failures like public goods, common property, externalities, ecosystem services. I was a chemistry major. You were an environmental science major. And I never took an environmental science class, but I was a chemistry major to go clean up toxic waste spills. I grew up in LA where the smog alerts were horrible. And I was, in my last podcast, we were talking about how I saw Soylent Green as like a 15-year-old kid. And I was like, wow, this is terrible. And it took me a long time to figure out how insidiously economics has taken over the worldview and the policy world, right? I mean, I'm not big on conspiracy theories, right? I think we did land on the moon. I don't know who shot Kennedy, but I don't think that Democrats are vampires that are kidnapping little children and drinking their blood or any of the QAnon rabbit hole. But I think people that were saying, I think the Catholic Church was protecting pedophile priests were regarded as conspiracy theorists, and they were right. People that were saying the NFL knows that their retired football players are suffering serious head trauma, and they didn't talk about it for a long time. There are some conspiracies that go through those three phases. Truth passes through three phases. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then it is accepted as having always been true. A conspiracy theory that I think is true is this idea of the Powell Memorandum, which was basically we're going to provide a pro-business, pro-growth, free market, anti-communism plan by putting academics in economics departments, creating think tanks like the Hoover Institute, etc., to take over the media and influence people's ideas. And they have sold us trickle-down economics. They have sold us greed is good. They have sold us individuals acting in their own self-interest, optimize the collective good. And all of that is counter to why Homo sapiens is the most successful species on the planet. We cooperate with one another, and this belief that individuals acting in their own self-interest optimizes social outcomes, I think, is a bad mythology that we've bought into that ties into this.
What did you call that? The Powell
Memorandum. I think maybe you should put a link in the thing about the Powell Memorandum. It's a very interesting piece that I learned about through Hunter Lovin's book, A Finer Future. It goes back to the Bretton Woods Accord, getting the dollar defined as the global currency. It's fascinating, and it ties into Barry Goldwater, and Ronald Reagan is basically the beginning of the ascent of this sort of neoliberal world order.
So which person named Powell was responsible?
Justice Powell. He was a justice on the Supreme Court, and he wrote a letter that's called the Powell Memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce, the United States Chamber of Commerce, explaining to them how they had to have a long-term strategy to infiltrate academia, take over government in a way that opposed regulation.
So the Koch brothers must have read that.
Oh, big time. They're part of it.
Wow.
Wow, all this is making me miss being a student. We don't get this really rich history lesson and analysis of how it's impacted our world today. I just don't get exposed to this type of thing very often, and it's fascinating. It makes me want to learn a lot more.
This is, I think, why I became an academic, is because I'm still learning, right? I'm not expressing this idea of the Powell Memorandum very well because I basically learned about it in the last couple years. It's fascinating, and it is fun to be a lifelong student. And, if we had an economy where we didn't have to work 60 hours a week, we could spend more time learning, entertaining each other. There's a lot of ways we could do zero emissions activities that are very rich and rewarding.
Yeah, there's the jobs plan for Joe Biden, is that we all share our jobs and work half time, cutting our footprint in half right there on the spot practically, and we have more time to be students.
Amen, brother.
So the sense I'm getting about COP26, it seems to me like there's a rising volume of recognition and acknowledgement of the fact that we have blown it. For all intents and purposes, we've blown it. That we don't have till 2050 to do much.
Oh, yeah.
That we have until 2030, maybe if we're lucky, and that nothing that happened at COP26, almost nothing, really gives us much hope of moving in that direction. But maybe a good summary of where we need to be and where COP26 gets us came from Catherine Hayhoe, who has been a longtime climate scientist in academia, but is now the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. And she published just a short little YouTube video with her assessment. And I'll put a link in the show notes so that you can find that clip and you can share that with others. But I edited it just for time a little bit, some highlights. So let me share that with you right now.
We're looking at every country in the world reaching agreement on specific words and language. And when you realize what a mammoth and unprecedented task that is, you realize just how challenging the scope of these conferences are and just how amazing it is that we actually even have what we have. Now, of course, from a scientific perspective, we don't have enough yet, but we do have more than we did before. So where are we right now? We have already experienced 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming. What does the Paris Agreement call for? It calls for holding warming below 2 degrees, which is the yellow area, and below 1.5 degrees if we can. These thresholds mean that we would be seeing widespread, consistent, almost continuous dangerous consequences the further and higher we go. So heading into Glasgow, where were we? We had enough current policies in place, and policies is an important word because it means that they're actually already being enacted. So we had enough policies in place to keep warming to 2.9 degrees Celsius. So where are we today? Do we have enough? No, not yet. Current policies now, after Glasgow, would hold warming to somewhere between 2.6 to 2.7 degrees, depending on which analysis you look at. So policies are things that have already been enacted. But of course, what countries promised in Glasgow, they haven't been able to enact yet. They have to go home and make it happen. So with their current commitments, we're looking at a warming of 2.4, which is a lot better than 2.9, still not good enough. But then we have countries like Canada, for example, that has net zero targets by a later date. Those net zero targets range from the 2040s to the 2070s, depending on which country has committed. And if all of the net zero commitments post-2030 are fulfilled, we'd be looking at a 66% chance of holding warming to 1.8 degrees Celsius. So there is still a lot more to do.
Well, that depresses the hell out of me.
Me too.
Yeah, so she did a pretty good job, I think, at painting, even though she sort of started out trying to put a little bit of a rose tint on it. She really was pretty honest about how far COP26 was from getting us where we need to go. You know, I've been working with Scientists Warning Europe, helping them publish a podcast called Planet in Crisis. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's some pretty interesting sessions. But they just wrote a new paper that they presented at COP26, and I think they held maybe 2 news conferences while they were at COP26, and one of them was with Tim Jackson, and I know you know Tim Jackson.
Yep, I went to that conference
did you go to that?
at COP26. That's one of the few experiences I had in the green zone that was very positive. And they basically said we need a radical transformation of our economic system, our food system, our greenhouse gas emissions. They did say population stabilization. It was one of the only places where I heard population stabilization, and governance, right? And so they were talking about radical transformation. That was the most inspiring thing I heard inside the COP. And I asked Tim afterwards. I walked up and said hi and thanked him for that scientist warning paper. If you could put a link in that to your podcast, that'd be great. Anybody that wants to sign it can, although they do ask for qualified people with PhDs to sign it. Uh-huh. And I said, what do you think about Brian O'Neill's shared socioeconomic pathways, where the economy grows, the population grows, and average human well-being grows in all the IPCC scenarios? He says, it's a fantasy. It is a complete fantasy. There's no way that that's going to play out. And that was pretty sad.
So I want to share just a clip from that news conference where Tim Jackson talks about what's wrong with net zero and with 2050. Yeah. This really gets to it. But first, I really want to, for anyone who isn't familiar with Tim Jackson, I think we should sing his praise.
So Tim Jackson is a British ecological economist and professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey, and he is the author of the book Prosperity Without Growth.
All right, so let's listen to Tim Jackson.
Net zero is a term that's used by the IPCC and by most politicians to account for the fact that we're unlikely to reduce our emissions far enough if we don't take political action, and we will need, as I said before, to then find technologies that pull them out of the atmosphere, so negative emission technologies. They're deeply contentious, their costs are uncertain, their effectiveness is unknown, and relying on them is a big mistake. So that tiny word net that sits in front of net zero by 2050 is one of the things that's wrong with the slogan net zero by 2050. The other is 2050. 2050 is not soon enough. And the climate science on this is just abundantly clear, and astonishes me that it has become so difficult to understand. In their latest IPCC Working Group 1 report, it sets out what is called a global remaining carbon budget. That's how much carbon we can afford to burn and put into the atmosphere between now and when we reach net zero. In other words, when there's a balance of carbon in the atmosphere. And that number is a very, very precise number. The estimate of the IPCC is that it is, at the end of this year, going forwards, we have around about 320 billion tons of CO2 that we could put into the atmosphere if we want to keep 1.5 alive. Everybody here in the blue zone is talking about keeping 1.5 alive. That has a very specific meaning in terms of carbon. It is that number, 320 billion tons of carbon. At the rate at which we're burning carbon at the moment, globally, that gives us about 8 years left before that carbon budget is blown and 1.5 becomes impossible. So heading for 2050 is a travesty of the environmental and climate science which tells us what needs to be done. And the 2050 targets of politicians, it seems to me, are only there because they are outside the electoral cycle.
Wow, super clear.
I'm experiencing deja vu all over again.
He is just being extremely crystal clear. And I feel like it's very hard to get that level of clarity from most of the other leaders that we're hearing from.
But it was interesting. Right after that, he said what the world has to do by 2030 to stay with 1.5 alive was 25% reduction in CO2 emissions every year. 25% per year, every year until you get to 2030 to keep 1.5 alive. And we're not even close.
No one's even pretending to be trying to do that.
Well, it's so depressing, right? So let's try and be a little more optimistic. I got tired of wandering around in the COP. I don't have a Gucci suit or anything, so I felt a little funny being sort of the scruffy academic wandering around.
Jeez.
And I went to the green zone where they had the public stuff and a bunch of corporate stuff. GlaxoSmithKline was there, and they made it impossible to get there, and the security lines were crazy. And once I finally got into the green zone, there was nobody there, and there was just all these people from Microsoft and pharmaceutical companies wanting to tell me how they were going to save the planet, and it was pretty nauseating. But I said, I'm going to go check out the protests. So I went to the Friday protest, and I went to the Saturday protest, and I chatted with people when I was taking trains and subways to get to where they started. They were inspiring. Right? The Extinction Rebellion was alive and well. You know, there was Extinction Rebellion all over the place. Posters on trains, posters on trash cans, posters on mailboxes. And these people were happy. They were depressed about the state of the world, but they were happy that they were amongst kindred spirits who recognized we had a problem. And the sense I got was a global strike is really what we have to have. Is just a general strike that says, I'm sorry, we need real change, not bullshit around the margins, not 2050 promises, not promises beyond the election cycle of our elected officials. They were all about a general strike. And so I encourage people to look at the photos. If you put a link to my thing, there's people with deeds, not words, you know. The photos are, you know, they're inspiring, and they basically echo Greta Thunberg, you know, blah, blah, blah. This is not serious enough.
So sorry, Steph.
Well, I do take hope from what you're saying, Paul, and that there is a ground truth out there. And despite the disconnect between what's happening in the streets of Glasgow and what's happening in the COP official hallways is discomforting. But the fact that a lot of people get it does give me hope. It does.
It was the only thing that gave me hope in Glasgow was the streets. And there were a lot of people out on those streets. And the posters, you know, the fly-by-night, you know, billboards that they put on trash cans all over the place outnumbered they had all these official banners about COP, right? But the sort of underground stuff was significant. And it was inspiring.
Mm.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what develops in that department.
Everything Tim Jackson said, 2050, are you kidding me? That's a joke. The science is done, right? I mean, that's something we might end on is the David Attenborough quote, you know. It's real, it's happening, and it's an impending disaster.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, for the reality check. It's important information that we need to hear. We need to hear what's going on. And more importantly, what isn't going on at the leadership level that is needed. And if they're not going to lead, we have to find another way. So thanks for sharing that truth with us.
My pleasure, Stephanie. And it's a pleasure chatting with you.
Well, and I've always felt like we can't just sit and wait for the policymakers to go where we need them to go. We've got to lead them somehow. Paul, you mentioned earlier, some of the other existential crises, and I just want to remind everyone that we've been talking about climate crisis mostly in this episode, which I'm thinking probably is looking like it is probably the most urgent human civilization killer, but it's certainly far from the only problem that's resulting from the fact that we've outgrown the planet. I mean, we've got fresh water crises ahead, we're running out of fertile soil, we've got resource scarcity issues, toxification of air, land, and water, species extinction, food supply challenges. We could solve the climate crisis, and that wouldn't solve all of those unless we solve the climate crisis by shrinking the scale of the human enterprise.
Amen.
As we wrap up, we do have our regular feature, Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint, in which we each share something of note that we do to shrink our own footprint. So, did you two come prepared?
I can tell you what I did. I knew there was a used car shortage when I came back from my sabbatical in Australia, and I had a Nissan Leaf that could go 80 miles on a full charge. Mm-hmm. But my wife suffered range anxiety in the car driving to Fort Collins and back. So I traded it in so someone could buy my used Leaf, right, because they are a little expensive. Mm-hmm. And I got a new Nissan Leaf using the subsidies that goes 240 miles on a single charge. And I would have driven it down here today, but the battery was tweaked and it's back at the dealership, and hopefully it will be running again. But sure. I drive an electric car and I charge it with solar panels on my roof.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah, very cool. So mine is pretty small today. I don't drink coffee. I'm a tea drinker, and I only heat up the exact amount of water I need for my tea. I have a tea pot that I use every morning, and I know exactly how many cups fit in, so I'm not heating and using more energy than I need.
Good for you. I'm
Just
impressed.
A small one.
It works.
Those little things add up. Well, I'm kind of proud of mine. You know what I did? And I did it just this morning. In our last episode, which was Rebelling Against Black Friday Consumerism, Kelly Dennings of the Center for Biological Diversity told us about the So Kind registry, a gift registry where you could set up online, kind of like a wedding registry, but just for any kind of gifts, where you could create a profile so that people who were wanting to give you a holiday gift or a birthday gift or whatever could go and see what you would like so that they're not guessing and potentially buying something wasteful that you didn't need. And you could even indicate, make a gift to this charity in my name or something like that. So I went and set up my profile this morning, and I put in there, I haven't begun to put worthy causes. Of course, the most worthy cause is the one that I donate 40, 50 hours a week to, which is the Growth Busters Project. But I'll put that in there for sure. But anyway, I set up my profile on the So Kind registry so that people wouldn't be buying crap that I don't need.
That's a great one.
I thought so. So it's sokindregistry.org is the place to go. We'll put a link in the show notes. And I suppose you can even find me if you want to send me a thank you gift. But if you want to thank me or Stephanie or Paul, perhaps, for the time that we invested in this podcast, I would say we're recording this episode on Giving Tuesday. You guys probably couldn't have missed that because your inbox is just completely over-cluttered with appeals from all really good causes. There are a million really good causes out there. But at the Growth Busters Project, we did not clutter your inbox on Giving Tuesday. Why? Because we're special. I just didn't want to contribute to that. And I wanted to kind of make the point that, you know what, if we don't somehow accomplish this culture shift that we need away from this worship of growth everlasting, then all of those causes are for naught. So in a way, Growth Busters is like the mother of all causes in a way. So don't forget us in your year-end giving. Click on the donate button at the top of the page at growthbusters.org and help us keep this podcast going and some of the other educational projects and culture shift projects that we have up our sleeves. Paul Sutton, thank you.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure being here. I can't express how much I appreciate what you do.
And we're glad that you are interfacing with young people as a university professor where you really can probably make some change. Those kids, I don't think it's too late. Sounds like we're on the verge of too late with some of them. So catch them while they're young, and we'll include a link to your commentary that was published in The Hill, to your photos from Glasgow, and some of the links that you included in there.
Again, Paul, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I I actually haven't listened to episode 26 where you were the guest, so I definitely plan to do that and learn even more from you.
You'll find that a very interesting episode.
James Ward is pretty funny.
Yep, that was a good conversation.
If you think this podcast is important, we hope that you might share the podcast with your social network, your friends or family. Subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app of choice so you can listen to the episodes as soon as they're released. All of these actions will help other people discover Growth Busters. And then if you haven't seen the documentary Growth Busters Hooked on Growth, it's now super easy to find. It's free on YouTube, and we will link that YouTube link in the show notes. Thanks for joining us.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.